for Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Infantry Division's Artillery Regiment, the morning of June 6, 1944, began like any other during his long watch on the Normandy coast. A thin, damp mist clung to the English Channel, softening the world into a grey silence. The air was cold, heavy with the familiar scent of salt, wet earth, and diesel from the nearby bunker generator. It was just after 5 a.m., another routine watch, another day of waiting for an invasion that German intelligence insisted would come weeks later, and certainly not here. But as Richter raised his Zeiss binoculars toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale light of dawn struggled to pierce the gloom, he saw something that defied belief. The sea was changing. Not with the tide, not with weather, but with presence. A dark line had formed where ocean met sky, a smudge at first, then a silhouette, then a wall. It grew sharper, denser, multiplying with every passing second. This was not a fleet. It was a city of steel. A floating metropolis, born of industry and will, sailing out of the mist and into history. In that moment, before a single Allied boot touched French soil, before the names Omaha or Utah meant anything to the world, Richter understood with chilling certainty, the Third Reich was about to drown. To grasp the full weight of that revelation, one must step inside the mind of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the fjords of Norway to the Pyrenees, Hitler's Atlantic wall stretched over 2,000 miles, a chain of bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, and tank traps meant to repel any invasion with brutal finality. Propaganda portrayed it as impregnable, a testament to German engineering and resolve. But Richter, a veteran of the Eastern Front, knew better. At 32, he was old enough to remember the Blitzkrieg of 1940, young enough to have survived Stalingrad's frozen hell, and pragmatic enough to see the truth: the wall was a myth dressed in concrete. His own position, a reinforced artillery battery nestled in a bluff overlooking what the Allies would soon codename Omaha Beach, was typical of the so-called fortress. His guns, 105mm howitzers, were well sighted, his men drilled, his observation post commanding. But the defenses around him were patchwork. Many bunkers stood half-finished. Minefields had gaps farmers used for decades. Fields of fire were blocked by hedgerows and dunes. And his division, though among the best in Normandy, was a shadow of the Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe. It was a mix of hardened Eastern Front veterans like himself and conscripts, boys of 17, reservists in their 40s, brave but untested, dutiful but outmatched. Worse still, they were in the wrong place. German High Command, led by Hitler himself, was convinced the main Allied invasion would strike at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest channel crossing, the logical choice. There, the mighty 15th Army waited with 19 divisions. Normandy? A sideshow, perhaps a feint. This wasn't mere error. It was the triumph of Allied deception. Operation Fortitude, a masterpiece of psychological warfare, had convinced Berlin that General Patton's Phantom, 1st U.S. Army Group, was poised to strike Calais. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, double agents like Garbo and Brutus, all fed the illusion. The result? On D-Day, only 6 German divisions guarded the entire Normandy coast. Richter's 352nd was one of them, and even it had only recently been moved to the coast, against the wishes of many commanders who feared exactly this. No one expected a thing. Then he saw it. At first, just a flicker on the horizon. He adjusted his binoculars, focused. His heart, steady from years of discipline, began to pound. It wasn't a patrol. Not a raid. It was ships, hundreds, then thousands. He swept left, then right. The entire channel was filled. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, packed so densely they seemed to form a single, undulating mass. The official tally would later confirm nearly 7,000 vessels from 8 Allied nations, the largest amphibious armada in human history. But to Richter, it wasn't a number. It was a physical force, a declaration of industrial supremacy so vast it rendered his concrete bunkers, his carefully calculated firing solutions, his very existence, obsolete. Germany had built a wall. The Allies had built a bridge, and brought the entire factory with them. He grabbed the field telephone, fingers slick with sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. I have visual on the channel. There are ships, thousands of them. This is the invasion." The voice on the other end was weary, dismissive. "We have reports of a few vessels. Possible raid. Stand by." "No!" Richter's voice cracked. "You don't understand. The sea is covered. Horizon to horizon. This is it." A pause. Then, "Oberleutnant, sea conditions are unsuitable. Your report is in error. I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look!" He slammed the phone down. Disbelief was the enemy's first weapon, and it was working perfectly. While Richter watched the armada form up, German command was distracted by scattered paratrooper drops inland, mistaking them for the main assault. No one was looking at the sea. So Richter acted alone. He shouted orders. His men, roused from sleep, stared in stunned silence. Then training took over. Shells were hoisted from the magazines. Rangefinders called out distances. The heavy barrels of the howitzers elevated, pointing toward the impossible. Just before 6 a.m., the order finally came: engage at will. "Fire!" Richter roared. The ground trembled. The first shell screamed out over the water. Then another. And another. Through his binoculars, Richter tracked their fall. Plumes of water erupted among the ships. Misses, but good ones. His men adjusted with disciplined precision. Then, a flash. A direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. Orange fire, black smoke. The ship listed, crippled, and would soon sink. A cheer rose from his battery. For a moment, it felt like war as they knew it, skill against skill, courage against courage. But the moment passed. The fleet did not scatter. It did not slow. The gap left by the Corey was instantly filled. The iron tide rolled on, relentless, indifferent. Richter fired again and again, but for every ship his guns might harass, 100 sailed past untouched. He was a man with a bucket, trying to empty the ocean. Then came the reply. It began as a low rumble from the horizon. Flashes lit the sides of battleships like silent lightning. Seconds later, the world exploded. The ground heaved. Geysers of earth and rock erupted around his position. The USS Texas, the USS Arkansas, the HMS Ramillies, ships that had fought at Jutland and Okinawa, were now turning their 14-inch and 15-inch guns on the Atlantic Wall. This was not bombardment. It was industrial dismantling, executed with mathematical precision. Richter scanned the sky. Not a single German aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once master of Europe, was absent. On D-Day, the Allies would fly over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe? Fewer than 300. The sky belonged to P-47s, Spitfires, C-47s, a ceaseless river of Allied air power. Where were the panzers? The 21st Panzer Division, the closest armored reserve, sat idle, waiting for Hitler's permission to move. By the time it rolled, it was shredded by fighter bombers before reaching the beach. In that moment, Richter's tactical mind shut down. A colder, deeper clarity took its place. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system behind them, the factories, the shipyards, the assembly lines. He pictured Detroit churning out trucks by the hour, Willow Run rolling B-24s off the line every 63 minutes, Pittsburgh pouring steel for tanks that would never run dry. He knew the numbers, even if he didn't have them memorized. In 1944, the United States alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's total tank production for the entire war would not match America's output in a single year. The myth of German superiority, the Tiger's power, the Panther's armor, was a trap. Those machines were engineering marvels, yes, but they were complex, fuel-hungry, and slow to build. The Allies didn't need to outfight them. They needed only to outnumber them. And they did, by orders of magnitude. For every German tank destroyed, 3 Shermans would take its place. For every pilot lost, dozens of fresh American aviators, trained on endless fuel and time, would arrive. This was the new reality of war, not won by willpower or ideology, but by tonnage, time, and throughput. Nazi propaganda had promised that a unified, racially pure Volk could overcome the decadent democracies through sheer will. But here was the proof: willpower couldn't stop a 16-inch shell. Ideology couldn't sink a Liberty ship. And no amount of fighting spirit could close the gap between 9,000 German aircraft produced in 1944 and America's 96,000. A profound despair settled over Richter, not of fear, but of finality. He and his men were not being outmaneuvered. They were being erased. They were participants in a contest that had already been decided, not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the boardrooms and factories of the Allied home fronts years before. The German High Command must have known. They must have seen the production charts, the shipping logs, the intelligence on American mobilization. Yet they had sent him here anyway, to die for a lie wrapped in mathematics. As the sun rose higher, the theoretical became slaughter. On Omaha Beach below, the first waves of American infantry hit the surf. Machine guns from German pillboxes tore into them. The water turned red. Bodies piled in the shallows. For a moment, it seemed the defense might hold. The 352nd was inflicting horrific casualties. Men who had fought at Stalingrad knew how to kill. But then the industrial equation asserted itself once more. In an act of desperate heroism, Allied destroyers, USS McCook, USS Karmik, HMS Talabant, steamed to within 1,000 yards of the beach, scraping their keels on sandbars, and opened fire point-blank on German strongpoints. Their 5-inch guns, precise and relentless, silenced bunkers that had dominated the beach for hours. At the same time, strange machines emerged from the surf, DKW amphibious trucks rolling straight onto the sand, Sherman tanks with flails detonating mines ahead of them, armored bulldozers clearing paths through wreckage. These were Hobart's funnies, British-engineered solutions to every obstacle Rommel had placed. The Germans had nothing like them. Innovation met industrial scale, and the beachhead was secured. Richter's battery became a priority target. Shells landed closer. One direct hit incinerated a gun crew. Another knocked out a howitzer. His phone lines died. He was alone, watching his command dissolve. Above, the sky remained a solid ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first wave of landing craft gave way to a second, then a third. Beyond them, the Armada waited, patient, inexhaustible. By day's end, the Allies would land 156,000 troops, 1,500 tanks, and 10,000 vehicles. The battle for Normandy had just begun, but the outcome was already sealed. In the weeks that followed, the fighting in the bocage, the dense hedgerows of Normandy, would be brutal, costly, and heroic on both sides. But it would change nothing. Every German tank destroyed was a permanent loss. Every Allied tank lost was replaced before the week was out. Every German soldier who fell left a gap that could not be filled. For Richter and the survivors of June 6, the rest of the war was an epilogue. They fought on, not for victory, but for duty, for comrades, for the faint hope of survival. But the dream of final victory had died at dawn, in the gray light of the Channel, when a man with binoculars saw a sea turn to steel and knew the Reich could not stand against it. We often imagine the end of Nazi Germany as a slow collapse, culminating in the ruins of Berlin. But for the men of the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single, shattering moment of revelation. It was not the loss of a battle, but the collapse of a worldview. They had been taught that spirit, discipline, and racial superiority would prevail. Instead, they faced a new kind of war, one decided not in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of Detroit, Seattle, and Glasgow. It was a war of systems, and theirs had failed. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, fictional, yet emblematic of thousands who stood on that coast, the morning of June 6 was not just the beginning of the end. It was the moment he understood that the future belonged not to the ideologue, but to the engineer, not to the fanatic, but to the organizer, not to the believer, but to the builder. And in that truth lies a lesson as enduring as war itself. No wall, however thick, can stand against an ocean of steel. Richter's realization that he was witnessing not just an invasion, but the physical manifestation of an industrial civilization at war, was not unique to him. It echoed in the diaries of other German officers that day, men who, like him, had been trained to believe in the supremacy of the Wehrmacht's tactical genius, only to find themselves staring at a force that rendered tactics irrelevant. But what made Richter's moment so emblematic was its clarity. He saw not only the ships, but the system that built them. Consider the scale of what floated before him. The Western Naval Task Force alone, responsible for Omaha and Utah beaches, consisted of over 1,200 warships and transports. It included 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, 93 destroyers, and more than 4,000 landing craft. But numbers alone don't capture the logistical miracle. Every one of those landing craft, the Higgins boats, the LSTs, the LCIs, had been mass-produced in American shipyards at a rate that defied European comprehension. The Higgins boat, for example, was built in New Orleans by a company that had once made shallow-draft riverboats for oil prospectors. By 1944, it was churning out one vessel every 10 minutes. Andrew Higgins, its creator, was called by Eisenhower the man who won the war for us. Without his boat, there would have been no beachhead, no way to get men and vehicles from ship to shore under fire. And it wasn't just hardware. It was the invisible architecture of supply. Behind every soldier waiting ashore was a chain of planning so intricate it bordered on the miraculous. The Allies had built 2 artificial harbors, Mulberry A and Mulberry B, prefabricated in England and towed across the Channel in pieces. They included floating roadways, concrete caissons sunk to form breakwaters, and piers that could offload 9,000 tons of supplies per day. When a storm destroyed Mulberry A at Omaha 10 days after D-Day, Mulberry B at Gold Beach kept the entire British-Canadian front supplied for months. Germany, by contrast, had no equivalent concept. Their logistics were reactive, improvised, and starved by fuel shortages and Allied bombing. Richter may not have known about the Mulberries, but he could see their effect. As the morning wore on, he watched as Dukas, amphibious trucks built on GMC chassis, rolled directly out of the surf and up the bluffs, carrying artillery, ammunition, and medical supplies. These were not experimental toys. They were standard issue, produced by the tens of thousands. The Germans had attempted their own amphibious vehicles, like the Schwimmwagen, but only a few thousand were ever built, and none could carry heavy cargo. The disparity wasn't in courage, it was in capacity to imagine, produce, and deploy at scale. This capacity extended to intelligence and deception. While Richter's superiors debated whether the landings were a feint, the Allies had already won the information war. Ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park had confirmed that German units in Normandy were understrengthened and mispositioned. Operation Fortitude had not only misled Hitler about the location of the invasion, it had kept 19 German divisions pinned at Calais for 7 critical weeks after D-Day. That was nearly 200,000 troops who never saw combat in Normandy. Rommel had begged for those reserves on June 6. He was denied them because Hitler still believed Patton was coming. Even the weather played into Allied hands, and not by chance. The Germans relied on a single meteorological station in the Channel, which predicted stormy conditions through mid-June. The Allies had access to weather data from transatlantic flights, U.S. Navy ships, and even clandestine reports from the Irish coast. Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, identified a 36-hour window of marginal but usable conditions on June 6. Eisenhower took the gamble. The Germans, lacking that data, assumed the storm would last. The result? Richter stood watch on a morning his commanders believed was safe. Back at his battery, the reality of isolation set in. His radio was dead. His telephone lines severed. He had no contact with regimental HQ, no orders, no updates. He was a single node in a defense network that had already been shattered by naval gunfire and airborne assault. Meanwhile, just miles inland, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were securing causeways off the beaches, blowing bridges, and sowing chaos. Many were scattered, some drowned in flooded fields, but their very presence convinced German commanders that the main attack was inland, not on the coast. This confusion bought the beach landings precious hours. On Omaha, the cost was horrific. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced the full weight of the 352nd, a division Berlin had mistakenly believed was 20 miles inland. In the first 2 hours, over 2,000 Americans were killed or wounded. The beach became a charnel house. But even here, industrial logic prevailed. When the initial assault stalled, junior officers and NCOs, men like Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry, stepped forward. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach," Taylor shouted. "The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Their leadership was vital, but so was the fact that they had endless reserves behind them. Wave after wave of landing craft kept coming. There was no last chance. There was only the next wave. By noon, Omaha was secured, not by a single brilliant maneuver, but by relentless pressure, naval gunfire support, and the sheer weight of numbers. Richter's battery, now under direct fire from destroyers and fighter bombers, ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Some of his men fled. Others died at their guns. Richter himself may have survived the day, many German officers did, but his war was over in spirit. He had seen the future, and it was not German. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated across Normandy. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces faced lighter resistance but the same industrial avalanche. By June 12, the Allies had landed over 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies. The beachhead was 60 miles wide and 15 miles deep. And still, the convoys came, Liberty's ships unloading at the Mulberries, C-47s dropping supplies by parachute, trucks rolling down newly built roads. Germany, meanwhile, could not move a single panzer division without it being spotted, bombed, and delayed. Fuel shortages forced tanks to be towed by oxen in some sectors. Replacement pilots arrived with 150 hours of flight time, less than their American counterparts had before even seeing combat. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was reduced to night harassment raids. Richter, if he lived, would have witnessed the collapse of Army Group B that summer, the encirclement at Falaise, the retreat across the Seine, the disintegration of entire divisions. Might have heard the rumors of officers plotting against Hitler, or seen the despair in the eyes of recruits who knew the war was lost but were forced to fight anyway. He would have understood that D-Day was not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning, the moment when hope gave way to arithmetic. And that arithmetic was brutal. By war's end, the United States had produced 300,000 military aircraft, 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 2.4 million trucks, 88,000 landing craft of all types, 5,600 merchant ships. Germany produced 119,000 aircraft, many never flown due to lack of fuel, 46,000 tanks and assault guns, 250,000 trucks, many horse-drawn by 1945. Virtually no landing craft. A handful of merchant ships, most sunk before completion. The difference wasn't in bravery. German soldiers fought with ferocity to the very end. The difference was in the ability to turn raw materials, labor, and innovation into war-winning systems, and to sustain them under pressure. America didn't just build more. It built smarter, faster, and with a logistical foresight that left its enemies stranded in the past. For men like Richter, the tragedy was not defeat, it was the dawning awareness that they had been sent to fight a war their leaders knew, deep down, could not be won. They were sacrificed not for victory, but for ideology, for pride, for the refusal to face reality. And in that sacrifice lies the true lesson of D-Day. No amount of tactical brilliance can overcome strategic bankruptcy. No wall of concrete can stand against an ocean of steel. And no nation that confuses myth for truth can survive the collision with reality. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the Atlantic Wall was already a relic. The beachheads were secure. The factories were still running. And the long, grinding machinery of Allied victory, impersonal, unstoppable, and utterly American in its scale, had begun its final turn. Richter may have lived to see the end. But he knew, in that grey dawn, that the Reich had already lost. Not because its soldiers were weak, but because its vision of the world was small, and the world it faced was vast.